Hello, this is Tomonori, your Japanese instructor. Today I'm going to talk about the review of chapters 1 through chapter 15. I'm going to talk only about the conjugations because that's the most important information for the level Japanese 104. Okay. So this is the verb conjugation. So these are conjugations you have learned so far. I just want to give a quick overview. The first, in Japanese, there are two different forms, major forms. Okay. The first one is polite form. And the polite form is often called the Masu-form. Or long form, since most polite form all polite forms end with mas. Okay, so that's why it's called the Masu-form, and it's also called the long form because compared with the other major form, which is plain form, it tends to be longer. So the other form is called a plain form, and it's also called the short form because compared with Masu-form, it's shorter. In Japanese, there are only two tenses. Okay, we have only present and past. Okay, so there is no future in Japanese. Right? In English, you have present, future, and the past, but in Japanese there are only two tenses, which is present and past, and usually present indicates the future as well. So if you say something like tabemasu, you might be talking about the right now, or you might be talking about the future. Okay, so there are two tenses, so each form has present tense and past tense. So there are two forms. Okay. And the next one is affirmative or negative, negation. And this is same as English, yes, you eat, or no, you don't eat. So each form, and for both present and past, you have affirmative, yes, I do, and negative, yes, no, I don't. So these are affirmative, negative, right? So there are 4 different forms for polite form and 4 different forms for plain form. Okay, and we have some special forms that we're going to talk about later. The first one, in Japanese, there are 3 different kinds of verbs. The first one is verb, verb, and irregular verbs. Okay. The easiest way to remember is start backwards. So start with irregular verbs because you have only 2 irregular verbs, which is shimasu and kimasu. To do and to come. So all you have to remember about irregular verbs are there are only 2 irregular verbs in Japanese, which is shimasu and kimasu, to do and to come. And next, if you look at the verbs and verbs, we have a way more verbs than verbs. Okay, so that's first thing you should know. And another thing is most of the verbs. Okay, so if you look at this color here, all the verbs have something called stem. So stem is the one in the dark color here. The stem is the place that do not change in conjugation. So no matter what kind of form it takes, stem won't change. Okay, so verb is a little bit easier to see how stem works. So if you see stems here, it's always tabe, right? So these all stems remain the same across conjugation. Okay. So let's take a look at nomimasu. So if you look at the nomi, it's no mi, right? And if you look at the stem of tabe, this is tabe. Okay. Usually verbs end with I. The stem of verb ends with I sound. So for example, nomimasu or yomimasu or kakimasu. So nomimasu, yomimasu, kakimasu, or verb, other verbs. What's a good verb? Shinimasu. Okay, so all the stems end with I. Okay, usually the stem of verb ends with tabemasu, but not always. So there are exceptions. It works almost always, but it doesn't work always. So for example, mimasu, the stem is mi. So it ends with I, but still mimasu is verb. But that's kind of like a good diagnosis to see if it's verb or verb. Okay, and then eventually you have to just memorize. When you get the new vocabulary, new verb, what you should do is you have to also memorize if it belongs to verb or verb. Okay, so that's the 3 verb types. Okay, so let's start. The Masu-form, conjugation Masu-form is very simple. So always the present affirmative end with masu, stem plus masu. So nomimasu, tabemasu, shimasu. The polite present negative is always masen. So nomimasen, tabemasen, shimasen. The polite past affirmative is always mashita. So nomimashita, tabemashita, shimashita. The polite past negative is always masen deshita. So nomimasen deshita, tabemasen deshita, shimasen deshita. Okay. So in a way, at polite forms, all you have to remember is these things. Okay. All you have to remember is masen, mashita, masen deshita. Okay, so let's move on to the plain form. The plain form gets a little bit trickier. Okay, and when you start with conjugations, the easiest place to start is again irregular verbs, because irregular verbs are called irregular verbs because they conjugate irregularly, right? So there's no way to predict, or there's no system to tell what is the conjugation of irregular verbs. You just have to remember. Okay. So if you look at the irregular verbs, the plain present affirmative is suru, or if it's kimasu, it's kuru. Okay. Shinai or 来ない、した or 来た、しなかった or 来なかった。Okay, so you just have to memorize these 8 things. Okay. And then again, the next process is do verb. Okay, and conjugation of do verbs is easy because, as I said, the stem of do verb won't change. And if you look at the do verb, we just said that nomi is the stem, but if you go beyond plain form, you start to see me gets dropped. We're gonna talk about the why you don't see me here, but it's not going to happen with tabe. The stem always tabe, right? So what you should do is pretty much the same as polite form as long as do verbs are concerned. Right? All you have to do is remember these 4 conjugation: る、ない、た、なかった。Okay? So always the plain present affirmative ends with る, such as 食べる、起きる、見る。The plain present negative, it always ない、so 食べない、見ない、寝ない。Present past affirmative is always た、so 食べた、見た、寝た。And plain past negative is なかった、so it's always 食べなかった、見なかった、読まなかった。読まなかった。寝なかった。Okay? So that's how it works. Okay? And let's take a look at the verb. Okay, and we talked about the stem because it's kind of important concept when it comes to verb. Okay, so we said that the nomi is the stem of verb, but that's not entirely true because the stem, the last sound of the stem changes with verb. So let's see what I mean. Okay, so this is nomi. So we said that the nomi is the stem, right? The stem changes in plain form with verbs. Okay, so but how it changes is actually very systematic. Okay, so let's move this nomi to somewhere. Let's use here. So what happens is with the plain present affirmative, I sound becomes U sound. Okay, so nomi becomes nomu. Yomimasu, which is to read, becomes yo, yomu. Okay, and kakimasu becomes kaku. Okay, shinimasu becomes shinu. Okay, so what's happening here is change I in the stem to U. Okay, you're gonna see the same change with the other plain forms. So when it's present negative, I becomes A sound. Okay, so nomi becomes noma, and add nai. Okay, so what's happening here is you get the ma because you changed the I sound to a sound. Okay, and then add nai. Okay, so it becomes nomanai, yomanai, tabenai, tabenai, kakanai, and shinanai. Okay, and for many different reasons, we skip the plain past affirmative. This is kind of the special case, so I skip this. And if you look at the plain past negative, the only difference between them is the what you added, right? So nomanai is nomanakatta. In the same way, yomanai, yomanakatta, kakanai, kakanakatta, shinanai, shinanakatta. So all you have to do is using different affix, nai, nakatta. Okay. So far we covered the plain, polite form and plain form. Okay, and then one of the biggest challenge with the first year Japanese was something called the te form. Okay, the te form is difficult because of verbs. Okay, irregular verbs, you just have to remember. Shimasu becomes shite, kimasu becomes kite. Okay, that's something you just have to memorize. Okay. Ru verb is always easy. Ru verb te form is stem plus te. So tabete, nete, mite. So it's very simple. In a way, it's the same process as the polite form, right? So you just have to memorize these affixes. Okay. So instead of these for te form, we use te. U verb is again, it's a challenge because it depending on the sounds, you use a different affixes for te form. Okay, and depends, like there are a few different ways to memorize this. Like some people did the utsurutte, mubununde, kuite, guite, surshite, and that's the one way to remember. Other people might have memorized a different grouping, but this is something you just have to remember. And I think it's in chapter 7 of the textbook, so you might want to go back if you're not familiar with the how to make te form with u verbs. So let's review chapter 7 if you're not sure. Okay, for now, just accept it as a fact that the te form of nomu is nonde. Okay, and we skip the plain past affirmative nonda because how you make nonda is you start with te form. So this is kind of interesting case because only this one you go from te form. Okay, so what you do is change to te, in this case de, to ta. Okay, so plain past affirmative of nonde is nonda, yonde, yonda, kaite, kaita, shinde, shinda. Okay, so all you have to do is change the last sound from te or de to ta or da. Okay, so that's why we skip this. You have to first go to te form and go to here because it looks like almost same as te form. Sometimes we call plain past affirmative ta form. So some people call this is ta form. like te form. Okay, but it's actually it's part of the conjugation system, plain past affirmative. Potential form, volitional form. I'm gonna skip these two because I guess by now you already know what you have to do. For irregular verbs, you just have to memorize できる and 来れる 来られる and しよう 来よう so you just have to memorize this. This 来られる来よう So you just have to memorize this. And for u verb, you just have to remember this stem, られる or よ. Okay. U verb, it's not as easy as lu verbs, but these two are not as difficult as te form. Te form is by far the most challenging conjugation in Japanese. And then in a way, you're gonna start seeing some pattern by now. Once you start the potential form and volitional forms, because what you're doing here, so we talked about how the plain present affirmative is changing I to U. So this is like you can see this. I'm gonna So we talked about how the plain present affirmative is I sound becomes U sound, and this is A sound, right? And then we just continue doing it. What's happening with potential form is A sound, and volitional form is O sound. Okay, so what we are doing is no me. The last I sound becomes nome, nomeru. So kaki becomes kakeru. Yomi becomes yomeru. So this is E sound. The potential form is associated with the E sound. Volitional form is O sound. So nomi becomes nomou. Kaki becomes kakou, and yomi becomes yomou. So I changes O. Okay. So that's how u verb works. So in a way, you have to associate each sound to the different forms. Plain, present, affirmative. The sound associated with it for u verbs is u. Plain, present, negative, it's A sound. Potential form is A sound. Volitional form is O sound. Okay. I'm going to show you the conjugations for adjectives and nouns. In Japanese, even nouns are conjugate. One thing. I'm not gonna go into details, but the easiest way to start with is start looking at the adjective and noun, because their patterns are almost identical, 99% identical. Okay. So in fact, some people consider adjective is nouns because it behaves almost the same as nouns, but it also behaves as an adjective, so it's kind of between them. Okay. And then adjective, you have to just memorize different patterns, but not as complicated as verbs. And there is no potential form and volitional form for adjectives. We have only te form. Okay, so this is a quick review of all the conjugations you have learned so far. I hope it was helpful, and I'm gonna show you some exercises you can do after this. Thanks.